Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 14th of May 2024. A couple of hours of being knocked out on the sofa and I'm back in the driving seat. So let's get on with the geopolitics concerning the war in Ukraine predominantly. So the Kyiv Independent says UK assures Ukraine of support after media reports of Trump-Cameron peace plan discussion. Okay, what happened here? There's a bit of firefighting from the UK diplomatic corps at the moment because the British government said on May the 13th, that's yesterday, that its stance towards supporting Ukraine has not changed after media reports of UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron allegedly pitching a peace plan to US presidential candidate Donald Trump, according to Politico. So if you remember, Cameron met Trump at the latter's Florida residence in early April, seeking to convince the likely Republican nominee for the November 2024 presidential vote of the need to continue supporting Kyiv. The Sunday Times reported on May the 12th that, according to an undisclosed senior source, Cameron said that further aid would help Ukraine hold the front lines and give Trump the best possible conditions to mediate a peace deal. According to the outlet source, Cameron passed the message to Trump: what are the best conditions in which you as president can make a deal in January? It's both sides holding their lines and paying a price for that. Interesting. Though the media reported at the time that Cameron's lobbying mission in the US was unsuccessful, Trump eventually backed a $61 billion funding bill for Ukraine, which passed with bipartisan support later in April. Cameron's proposal, as described in the Times article, differs from London's public position on possible peace talks between Kyiv and Moscow. Cameron himself has said that peace comes through strength, not through appeasement and weakness. Of course, what goes on behind closed doors is another thing entirely. There is all sorts of cajoling and attempts to convince and using different, tactics. This might have been a case of I don't really agree. I'm speaking as Cameron here. I don't really agree that this is the way forward, but I know how intransigent Trump is and I know how entrenched he is in that position. So I need to appeal to that position. So if he thinks, he's going to get in and do a deal and force Ukraine to the negotiating table, then I have to appeal to him in that position. So, okay, Trump, you're going to come into power and going to do that deal. You need to make sure that you can do that deal so that it is as easy as possible for the sides to come to an agreement, so that it makes you look good, right? This is kind of what Cameron's thinking and playing on Trump's narcissism. So it's like, okay, so therefore you look best if Ukraine is in a really good position and is happy to go to the negotiating table. They're not going to go to the negotiating table if they're losing ground, because actually, although there is an argument that would force them to the table, but essentially Ukraine want to go to the table if they are in a commanding position, and they'll be in a more commanding position if the US gives them an absolute ton of aid. And so then the aid goes through, gets bipartisan endorsement, and Trump gets in maybe in November 2024 and he says, right, look at me, I can make peace happen. So I that's how I would interpret that happening. I wouldn't say that this necessarily means that this is Cameron's or the UK's position. Nonetheless, you can imagine that it has caused a bit of consternation. A spokesperson has said for the British government, I don't recognise these reports. Those reports, our position has not changed. Putin must fail. We will support Ukraine for as long as necessary to repel Russian aggression. And then Grant Shapps has been wheeled out today, the defence secretary. The UK will not force or persuade Ukraine to accept a bad peace treaty, especially one that entails a loss of territory. So, yeah, he's doing a bit of mopping up after that issue. But I wouldn't be, and I'd be the first person to criticise David Cameron, right? And what he may be up to if it's nefarious. But actually, I think that's probably a little bit of psychologizing with Trump personally. But do you know what? Correct me if you think I'm wrong. Right, security agreements are being negotiated with Norway, Belgium, USA and the EU. That's with Ukraine and indeed Luxembourg. Luxembourg, I think, are negotiating today with Ukraine. There's an ongoing discussion among partners about the possibility of sending military contingents to Ukraine. France, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Netherlands, Poland, Norway, Czech Republic, Finland and Canada do not rule out such a prospect. I wasn't sure Poland were on board with that, but I could be wrong. and Moldova are going to sign with the EU as security pact as well. I think that's super, super important. They're really vulnerable with an election looming and Russian interference incredibly making the region incredibly volatile. Moldova and the EU intend to sign a security agreement in the next week, increasing defence cooperation to unprecedented levels, according to Financial Times. Polish border blockade temporarily led to Ukraine's export and import losses of $660 million. Imagine they had $660 million to spend on whatever they like, the Ukrainians. Imagine they could buy military equipment with that amount of money. Like the last US aid bill is $400 million. Like they lost $660 million. That's how painful that was. And that's why I just think the Russians had to have something to do with it. Yes, there might well have been, and there almost certainly were, genuine grievances with the hauliers and the farmers. But, they weren't choosing to blockade Belarus. They weren't choosing to constrict Russian imports. It's really annoying that is all that money has been lost for Ukraine. Poland, sticking with them, will allocate over $25 million to boost intelligence services amid rising threat from Russia. According to Prime Minister Donald Tusk, the country became a key target for Russia's intelligence agencies as its distribution hub for aid to Ukraine, the official warned. I think there's just huge. There are huge challenges for Europe, for the US, for many countries around the world. Latin America is a hotbed of Russian disinformation and interference. Well, there is an article in The Guardian today, Russia directing hackers to attack UK and the West, says the director of GCHQ. So this is our intelligence agency. So Russia is increasingly seeking to encourage and direct hackers to attack British and other Western targets, says the director in her first keynote speech as head of the British Intelligence Agency. Anne Keyes-Butler said her agency was, quote, increasingly concerned about the growing links between the Russian intelligence services and proxy hacker groups who have long taken advantage of a permissive environment within the country. Quote, before, Russia simply created the right environments for those groups to operate, but now they're nurturing and inspiring those non-state cyber actors, she said in a speech to Cyber UK conference, in what was described as a globally pervasive threat. The spy chief appointed last year to be the first woman to hold the role referenced the threat from ransomware, quote, the most acute and pervasive cyber threat where criminals, typically from Russia, take control of a company's data and systems and demand significant sums to regain access. GCHQ was doing everything we can to counter ransomware actors, she said, degrade their ability to attack systems across government and business and to produce intelligence that means those involved in ransomware are held to account. There is no hiding place for cyber criminals, she added. So a week ago, if you remember, Britain's National Crime Agency announced it had unmasked Russian national Dmitry Koryshev as the administrator of the Lockbit ransomware group, whose hacking tools were used to carry out more than 7,000 attacks between January 22 and February 24 in the US, UK, France, Germany, and China, and elsewhere. So on and so forth. So it's just this is where we are going to be emphasizing in allied nations in the West a lot of resources, policy, because there are huge threats within the whole context of this hybrid warfare that Russia is conducting on the world. As I've said before, this is a world war. We are in World War III. Most of the nations of the world are somehow involved to differing degrees in the war in Ukraine and with Russia. And we are providing NATO, many allies, 50 different nations are providing weaponry to Ukraine to fight the conventional war. And meanwhile, we are fighting in the information spaces. We are fighting the cyber war with Russia and with China. And then China's helping Ukraine. Iran's helping Ukraine. And then you've got the connection of, you've got these overlapping conflicts. So you've got the Houthis and Gaza and Israel, and that overlaps with Iran, and then Iran to Russia, and North Korea, South Korea, North Korea to Russia, China to Russia. And then you've got India spending all the money at the moment on Russian weaponry. There's apparently $4 billion worth of money going into Russia from India, and all sorts of things going on. So I say we are in a world war. You might not realise it. Speaking of which, by the way, I am going to be giving a talk in North Hampshire. I am going to put an email address in my description if you are in that sort of area. In June time, shoot an email only if you're genuinely interested. It's a very small venue, so if you live in the local area, just come and have a chinwag and see me talk about all the stuff I normally talk about. So you probably know what I'm going to say. Anyway, it is going to be about we're in World War. Half of Ukrainian refugees in Germany, Poland and Czechia said they are less likely to return to Ukraine. Quote, less likely to return to Ukraine. I don't know what that means, taken out of context. To be honest, I need to read the article, but I haven't had a chance today. Less likely than what? Less likely than a badger to return to Ukraine? Less likely than they were a week ago, a year ago? According to a poll by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. I'm sure the poll is perfectly good, but the reporting for Kyiv Independent is somewhat lacking in important detail there. The idea is that we know this. The longer people live in a foreign country, the more difficult it is for them to return. They get their roots are put down. If they've got children, they go to school, and it's not ideal to then go, 2 years later, we're going to go back to Ukraine, even though they might in their heart of hearts want to do that. But then, of course, with mobilization, challenges, so on and so forth, and a threat of Russia in general, people are seemingly more open to staying in those countries to which they have fled. Right. We have Secretary of State for the US, Antony Blinken, in Kyiv this week. He's had some meetings today with Zelensky and the team about the military situation. Myriad reasons for his visit, but among them may be questions raised over the sacking of Alexander Kubrakov, Deputy Prime Minister. I didn't know that had happened. He reportedly had good relations with the US Embassy. So there's been some shifts in the Russian hierarchies. There's been some moves in personnel changes in the Ukrainian governmental and military hierarchy as well. So Antony Blinken himself says, I returned to Kyiv today to demonstrate our unwavering support for Ukraine as they defend their freedom against Russian aggression. And so there's been lots of talk about an aid package coming soon, but unfortunately a lot of people wanting there to be statements about being able to use American weapons inside Russian territory, because Kharkiv, for example, is a staging point for Russian attacks, and yet the Ukrainians can't hit them inside Russia with things like HIMARS and other American weapons. It's just really, really frustrating. Now, this is just a random Twitter claim here, so I don't know the details of this, but Jakub Janovsky says any citizen of a NATO country still remaining in Russia without a diplomatic passport is a reckless fool, unnecessarily risking becoming a hostage. Well, a Russian court has detained a US citizen for using obscene language during a search of his apartment, according to Kommersant. So, don't use bad language with those Russians. They are notoriously prudish and definitely don't use bad language themselves. There must be still a whole host of people from NATO nations and European nations still in Russia, still toiling away, doing their jobs or whatever. And it's a risk for themselves, but also, of course, they can end up being used as leverage by the Russians. US President Biden has signed a new law that bans the import of Russian enriched uranium. Amazing that they have still been importing uranium for the last 2 years, but they have, while unlocking $2.72 billion to boost the US domestic uranium industry. And Putin is to visit China on May the 16th and 17th to meet Xi Jinping. They do meet quite a lot because they not only have official visits, like bilateral visits, but also the CTSO, then the Shanghai group, and there are 3 different groups, I think, that both countries are involved in, and they generally meet quite a few times a year. But this is, they are pretty close at the moment diplomatically. I know that it's a marriage of convenience, not necessarily best of friends, but they are definitely finding some solace in each other's company at the moment. This would be Putin's first trip abroad since he was inaugurated for his 5th term in office. And to add to that, the US is to increase tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles by 100%. I need to check the details of this, but it will also include a 25% growth on lithium-ion EV batteries and a 50% on photovoltaic cells used in solar panels. The Biden administration continues to diversify and intensify its economic statecraft towards China, though he's simply continuing what Trump started in 2018 with decoupling. So under the Trump administration, China was enemy number one. There was a trade war, tariffs and all sorts. This is economically risky because there's a lot of goods that come from China, cheap goods, and if you start putting tariffs on, obviously they become more expensive, but also it can lead to a trade war that then leads to inflation, and it is not economically, well, it depends what your economic position is, whether you believe in free trade, in which case there should be no regulation, no tariffs. This whole thing about Trump's trade war, if you were holding up the Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged as some kind of libertarian, I think we should have small government, we shouldn't be involved in regulation, and then you're whacking tariffs on in some kind of industry protectionism, then you are moving away from that free market model. But that's not to say the free market model is always good, right? I'm very critical of I believe in a mixed economy, so I don't necessarily have an issue with protectionism at all. It's just that some people do, but they end up often having double standards by saying, I don't like this, but then when their favoured politician does it, they're like, oh yeah, it's fine, it's brilliant, we should protect American industry. It's like, okay, that's fine, I don't disagree with that, but don't call yourself like a super free marketeer if that's what you espouse. So just know your economics. I guess know your own economic stance. Here, you can present heaps of arguments for this kind of approach and heaps of arguments against it. A decoupling from China, depends what your entire strategic view is with regard to diplomacy with China, and whether you kind of do we're going to change you by working with you, or we're going to push you away and demand that you change. But of course, that will make you possibly entrench in your position and increase tensions and make it more volatile. So I'm presenting no answer to this because I don't know nearly enough about exactly what should be done in such a situation. It's easy for me to cast my simplistic opinion, but this is the direction the present government is going in the US, and it follows on from what Trump's position was broadly on China. Although there's this idea of don't see them as an enemy, see them as a sort of competitor in the marketplace. Guys, introducing protectionist policies doesn't equate to anti-capitalism. What is this conflation nonsense? So again, the guy that said this said, it's not. It depends. There are different forms of capitalism. There's a more mixed approach versus your complete end of the spectrum free market capitalism. So take your pick. Right, we're going to Georgia for most of the last bit of this video. Another night of protests in Tbilisi in the night before today, which was the day of the third hearing for the foreign agents law. Georgian Parliament will consider law on foreign agents in the final reading today. These protesters were gathering before the parliamentarians went into the Georgian Parliament to do that. Then there was a big fight in Parliament. A fight broke out in the Georgian Parliament between the ruling party MPs and opposition members during the discussion of the law on foreign agents. Local media report the Parliament session was interrupted. And then the Georgian Parliament passed a bill because the Georgia Dream Party, which is now pro-Russian, I think fairly overtly, has a majority in Parliament. I don't know whether they would if the vote came, if they held elections today, but it does make you wonder that when they do hold elections, whether they will be free and fair, because the Georgia Dream Party and Russia will want Georgia Dream to maintain their power and to maintain their pro-Russian stance. And you can imagine they will be doing some democratic backsliding. And you can argue that this law does exactly that. We're going to look into the law in a second. So they passed the bill on the foreign agents in the third reading despite mass protests, and protests are going on outside today. Georgian MPs greenlit controversial plans to brand hundreds of NGOs, non-governmental organisations and media outlets as foreign agents on Tuesday, paving the way for a bill to become law despite growing domestic dissent and condemnation from the US and the EU and the UK, actually. David Katsavara, leader of the anti-occupation movement, was severely beaten while being detained at a rally against the law on foreign agents. Katsavara is currently in hospital. This photo shows he received serious head injuries. You can see him, this TV crew is filming, and they grab him. They go out and they find him, they get him and take him and beat him. And there's these seething masses of black-clad Russian... Oh, it's Freudian slip, but that's what I'm going to come on to say. There are huge numbers of Georgian policemen. Right, Georgia is not a big country. It's got the population of just more than Birmingham in the UK, plus surrounding areas. Isn't it about 3 million? In fact, let's go and check that out. So, given it has... there we go. Georgian population, 3.7 million, yeah. So, I guess twice the size, 1.5 times the size of Birmingham if you know your UK geography there. So it's not huge, and to have that many policemen doing and nefarious entities doing this work, they've got seething masses of black all over the place, and you're wondering, have they drafted in people from Russia? Are there was that policeman shouting in Russian that was caught on camera a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, it is challenging there. And the other thing that I was thinking is that 3.7 million people isn't big. So if you've got all these protesters, like maybe 50,000 protesters on the streets of these various cities, and you've got the police beating them up, then you are going to know someone in the police in your extended family, and the police are going to be connected to people that ended up beating up. It's all like, it's not like a massive 140 million country where you're bringing in internal security services from outside, and they come to a big city and they beat people up and whatnot, and it's a much bigger city anyway, bigger than like 3.7 million, say if it's Moscow or whatnot. So this is a much smaller place. I just get the sense that they must be drafting in other people, and there must be some tensions with internal security service members just beating up their own family and friends, and I wonder how that plays out. Anyway, since 2008, Putin has shown slowly gained control of Georgia, but he failed to get control of Georgians, said Jay in Kyiv. Like Ukrainians, Georgians are free people and Russians are slaves. I mean, let's see what I talk about. See what I'm talking about here. That is a huge number of policemen. Just look at that. Look at that, going back all that distance. So, yeah, I wonder how many of these are policemen, how many are Secret Service, how many are armed forces, how many are thugs, the paid thugs they have. Anyway, it's interesting, good news that, for example, The Guardian, I'm sure many others, have got this on their front page. There's a whole live thing on Georgia, which is, I think, good to show that this is serious and the Western media should be taking it seriously. Riot police moving on protesters after foreign agents bill passed into law. It could go either way, this. I really do wonder what is going to happen, whether, like I've talked about the last few days, whether the carrot or the stick works more effectively to shut down, to either appease or to shut down protest, or whether if you use the stick too much, then that protest gears up into a whole, evolves into a whole different thing. I don't know, but US spokesman says foreign agents law is wrenching apart Georgia's partnership with the US. So this really is looking like it's, Georgia's doing this, right? So on the one hand, you've got the administration going in that direction, you've got the people going in that direction. But if the administration win, then they're right over with Russia now and away from the EU, away from the US, and the other half, the people side of that, want to go in a completely different direction. Lithuanian President Nausėda signaling support for protesters, so on and so forth. So what I wanted to do is just read this, was why are they protesting against the foreign agents bill? So I think there might be a bit of a lack of understanding about what this is. So thousands of Georgians have been demonstrating since April the 17th when the country's parliament approved the first reading of the bill. Protesters, largely young people, say it will sabotage the Caucasus countries' hopes of joining the EU and stifle civil society. It's been described as the Russian law by critics as it resembles repressive legislation used by the Kremlin and indeed used by Hungary. Georgia, with a population of 3.7 million, joined countries trying to gain accession to the EU when it granted official candidate status was granted last December. The political crisis comes at a time when many Georgians fear their country is moving away from the West. Quite everyone clearly understood that the purpose of the adoption of the Russian law is not the notorious transparency, but the change of the country's foreign course and the completion of Russification, Transparency International Georgia said at the end of April. The government, which has been in power for 12 years, claims to be pro-EU. It started off being pro-EU, but those pro-EU parliamentarians slowly were attrited away, and now they are much more, I think, overtly pro-Russian. But it has avoided placing sanctions on Russia over the war in Ukraine, and critics claim it's been seeking to strengthen ties with the Kremlin. The ruling Georgia Dreams party's founder, Bidzina Ivanishvili, has defended the bill and lashed out the West in a recent speech heavy with conspiracy theories. The billionaire hit out a global party of war and suggested the country's pro-Western opposition was controlled by foreign intelligence services. This is very much like Euromaidan, isn't it? The comments further fueled fears among the government's critics that the ruling Georgia Dream party, which has been in power again since 2012, could crack down on dissent before parliamentary elections later this year. But it doesn't really explain much about the bill, but we'll look at it here. So the bill, it would force non-governmental groups and media to register as organisations serving the interests of a foreign power if more than 20% of their funding comes from overseas. And this is where some people say, look, what's wrong with the bill? The bill appears to be saying, look, we don't want foreign funding in our political space. We want it to be ourselves funding ourselves so that we can control our own future. We're not being manipulated by outside entities. But actually it goes much further, as mentioned, with media entities, NGOs. In fact, there was a meme I saw, or it wasn't a meme, there was a tweet I saw with a picture of all the Georgia Dream politicians, and most of the politicians would not be in the place they are at without if this rule been put in place. So there are loads of people that had fellowships for foreign fellowships to do with outside academic institutions or this and that. It has a really, I think, constrictive effect on the Georgian political system, and it allows the ruling party or the ruling party in Georgia to have that much more control over the outcome of elections. CNN reports here that on the law. So what is Georgia's Foreign Agents Bill and why is Europe so alarmed? The bill would require organisations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence or face crippling fines. The legislation was drafted by the Georgian Dream Party, which along with its allies controls parliament. The proposal will receive a vote on Tuesday. That's been gone. The Georgia president, so she's against this, and she's against what Georgian Dream is doing. Zurabishvili called the bill an exact duplicate of its Russian counterpart in an interview with CNN. She's vowed to veto the bill, but that won't mean much. Georgia's government is a parliamentary system, so she's effectively a figurehead. Real power lies with the Prime Minister. Georgian Dream billionaire founder, former Prime Minister Ivanishvili, also wields political influence. So why is it so controversial? A couple of reasons. The proposed law is modelled after a similar one in Russia that the Kremlin has used to increasingly snuff out opposition and civil society. Many Georgians fear their foreign agents bill will be used in the same way it has been used by its northern neighbour to quash dissent and free expression by going after non-governmental organisations with financial ties overseas. Georgian Dream contends the legislation will promote transparency and national sovereignty and has hit back at Western criticism over the proposal. But the law's possible passage has touched on a more existential question, whether Georgia's future lies with Europe or Russia. Georgia has, like Ukraine, been caught between the two geopolitical forces since achieving independence in 1991. Many Georgians feel deep hostility toward the Kremlin, which invaded Georgia in 2008 and occupies about 20% of its internationally recognized territory, about the same proportion that Russia occupies in Ukraine. So Georgia has two two areas, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that have been effectively annexed, nicked, stolen by Russia. Absolutely outrageous. But they feel really passionately about this, and I think it's probably as much about the law as it is about the direction of travel, really, for the country. Finally, a little bit more context from Reuters here. Georgia's opposition dubs the bill the Russian law, comparing it to legislation that the Kremlin has used to crack down on political opponents and silence dissent. And that's the key. In Russia, hundreds of journalists, politicians, rights organizations, environmental groups, LGBTQ support networks and others have been listed as foreign agents, obliging them to label themselves as such every time they publish anything on social media or elsewhere. The use of the term foreign agent, which carries connotations of spying, has been used to create a climate of suspicion around people and organizations that the authorities want to portray as subversive. Critics of Georgia's foreign agents law say it's part of a wider authoritarian trend by Georgian Dream, which has recently passed a law to assert its control over the Electoral Commission. Oh, who knew? And has proposed sweeping restrictions on LGBT rights ahead of elections due by October. The new bill is almost identical to the one introduced in March 2023, but at that time there was huge opposition to that, and they kind of moved away from that. But then they've just brought it back, and they've succeeded in getting that through. So we'll see how that goes moving forward. Right, I spoke to you about the attempt for the Netherlands to create a coalition government, and I said it's looking like, I was reading out comments from Rick, a Dutch commenter, who said, although I'm not pro PVV or Wilders, Geert Wilders is the Dutch right-wing populist. If they go into coalition, then they might have their extremes tempered. They seem to have changed on getting on their Euroscepticism. They seem to have changed a little bit on Ukraine, possibly. But then there are other opinions. Here's JR, who says, and thanks for this, he's obviously Dutch, he helps with the mapping. On the Dutch subject, it's still not that cut and dry whether the four parties will form a new Dutch government. The four parties involved in negotiations are the far-right PVV, the liberal-conservative VVD, the agrarian BBB, and the centre-right newcomer NSC. They've been working toward forming a right-wing government. Recently, there were some signs of progress as they spent up to 10 hours a day at the negotiating table and submitted their financial plans to the Economic Planning Agency, CPB. However, public spending remains a sticking point. The VVD is pushing for an austerity plan to keep the national deficit within the EU limit of 3%, while the PVV advocates for increased spending on social security and healthcare. Interesting from a right-wing populist party. Additionally, negotiators Richard van Zwol and Elbert Graf are set to deliver their conclusions to Parliament by 11:55 p.m. on Wednesday, and they have started, and there will be no extension. After a day of rest yesterday, formation talks resumed today, more than 5.5 months after the elections. There is still no clarity on whether there will be a cabinet consisting of the PVV, VVD, NSC and BBB. Time is running out as next Wednesday marks the deadline for this round of negotiations. The finish line appears to be in sight, but the final outcome remains uncertain. Informateurs Van Zwol and G. Graf aim to be ready before midnight on that day. This means that negotiators must reach an agreement by then, and the groups from the four parties must also concur before that time. Furthermore, the parties have agreed to pursue an extra parliamentary government if they succeed in reaching an agreement aiming for a balanced mix of ministers from both inside and outside the political sphere. This development comes after months of deadlock following the elections. Now, this, if I remember correctly, this is one thing that I think the Netherlands gets really right in the political landscape, and I think we should do this in the UK. I think other countries should do this, which is a kind of technocracy. So a technocrat is an expert that's in power, right? So what we do in the UK is we say, right, we're going to make a cabinet. We've got 326 MPs from my party, and let's have a go. You're going to be the education minister. You're going to be the treasurer, chancellor of the exchequer. You're going to be the defence minister. And the defence minister goes, yeah, hang on, mate, I've got absolutely no experience of this. Yeah, but you went to school with the bloke that did X, Y, and Z, so I think you'll be a good choice. Okay, and then what happens is you have a cabinet. You do try and fit expertise to the role to some degree, but it's not always possible. And you have your favourites, and you want to give them a really good position because they're a loyal supporter of you. And then you have people who just aren't really very experienced in the position of power in your country that are delivering policy for a particular area. And then what happens is you go, well, actually, you three are a bit crap, so we're going to have a cabinet reshuffle. So a couple of years into it, just when these guys are starting to get skilled up, you have a cabinet reshuffle. They're either out or they're moved to another department. So now you've gone from education to Department of Work and Pensions. And you're like, hang on, my head is completely in education and now I'm DWP. Like... And you have to go and relearn the entire... And this genuinely happens. Like, cabinet reshuffles happen all the time. In the Netherlands, I don't know how much this happens, but they have people from outside of government that are elected into the head of departments. So you might have someone who's head of the education department who is actually an educationalist, who's been brought from outside, not a parliamentarian, doesn't represent any particular party. They will have their own personal opinion, of course, and they're probably going to be aligned with the party that gets them in. But the idea is you're getting an expert in to run that department who is expert in that department's subject matter. It makes so much sense. So I'm quite an advocate for technocracy. I would like to see empirical data. I don't know how you can get empirical data on whether technocracies are successful or not, whether the policies are better. I don't know if that's too subjective a metric. Anyway, and finally, I'm just going to say just another comment. I did that one on Trump and javelins and said, look, Trump wasn't responsible for the javelins going across. That was part of an evolution of aid that came from 2014 onwards, and it was his administration. It was the DOD, the State Department, and the Pentagon, and some of the aides around him and indeed Congress, bipartisan pressure for lethal aid to go to Ukraine that came it got to this situation where Trump was actually reluctant to give javelins to Ukraine, and then had to be convinced that it would be in the best business interest of the US that they would then go and buy loads of javelins off the kind of free market, and therefore that's great and we're going to make loads of money. And Trump was like, okay. So anyway, I presented that video and presented the evidence for that, etc., etc. But actually, a key component of that I forgot to talk about, and of course. So someone has written an absolutely fabulous comment here, and I love it. Nathan Langley has said, "Hi, Jonathan. Okay, blah blah blah." So he then says he gives a timeline of lethal aid being sent to Ukraine in 2017, and basically, so just really quickly, December 2013, Maidan Revolution. John McCain speaks to the crowd assembled at Maidan Square. February 20th, 2014, Russia invades Crimea. March 2014, McCain calls for lethal aid publicly in Kyiv. March 2014, McCain tells the US Senate Republicans not to call themselves Reagan Republicans for not passing the package that provides aid to Ukraine and sanctions on Russia and Russia's invasion. And I've shown you that video before of him on the Senate floor saying that, and actually basically calling out MAGA Republicans, although they weren't there. People who were not up for this. He's saying, you call yourself Reagan Republicans, you aren't my kind of Republican, blah, blah, blah. It was absolutely brilliant. And then September 2014, after the Minsk agreement, BBC interview, McCain calls out Putin's intent like Nostradamus. I've shown you that video as well before. April 2016, McCain urging the Obama administration to supply defensive weapons to Ukraine. August 2016, Congress removes provision for lethal aid to Ukraine. Trump claims he had nothing to do with it. Trump demonstrates how clueless he is about the whole Ukraine situation. He simultaneously blames Obama for letting Russia take Crimea while trying to keep his own foot in a door with and defending Putin. He also claims that he hears the people of Crimea would rather be with Russia. That's literally what Trump has said. So if you talk about, well done Trump for giving javelins, it's like, listen to his words. December 2016, Trump is attempting to deflect attention from Russian interference in the election. All of these have video evidence, by the way. Every single one of these is linked. February 2017, McCain pens a letter along with pressure from Nikki Haley and some of the Republicans who voted against the 2024 Ukraine aid package, urging a reluctant Trump to provide lethal aid to Ukraine. So there was a letter sent from Republicans to get him to do this. March 2017, I can only put this in here to show the contrast of Lindsey Graham in the past. Lindsey Graham was very strong on aid and has been fairly consistently until he wasn't because of Trump. March 12th, 2017, McCain discusses relationships with the Trump administration and Russia and unanswered questions. May 25th, 2017, Trump's NATO pay up speech for the protection racket. May 30th, Same year, McCain says Putin is a bigger threat than ISIS. June the 13th, same year, McCain questions Attorney General Jeff Sessions about discussions with Russia on election interference and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. July, Trump thanks McCain for a yes vote on healthcare repeal, a pressure tactic. And then in July 27th, he did the thumbs down vote against that. And then Trump-McCain relationship during Trump's first year as president is evidence there. So they didn't get on. So Trump would probably want to do the opposite of what McCain wanted. Trump releases lethal aid to Ukraine eventually in December after all that persuasion. And then, we got Rex Tillerson, John McCain passed away, blah, 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 blah. The whole point of this is to say, if anyone is responsible for the javelins going to Ukraine, so when we've heard Trump say, I did this, it was me that gave them more aid than they'd ever been given before, I'm amazing. Actually, if we should congratulate any politician, anyone who isn't like an aide or in a DOD or whatever, it should probably be John McCain. And there are frickin' receipts for that. There's a big old paper trail, there's a big old video trail of McCain very clearly, and I'm saying this as a pro-Democrat, but McCain was super correct on Ukraine. He honestly was. He was absolutely bang on point. So if you should congratulate any one individual, and you could look at people like, was it Catherine Crofton and others around Trump that actually convinced him to do that. But anyone else, it should be John McCain. And I thank Nathan Langley for pointing this out, because I can't believe I completely forgot to talk about him, having shown a bunch of the videos that he puts in as evidence to you over time. Anyway, that's enough from me banging on. Take care, guys. Speak soon.